I'm Laraine Stephenson, 32, a successful real estate attorney who thought I had everything figured out. After 18 hours of labor, I came home with my newborn daughter to find my mother-in-law had changed the locks on my own house, the one I purchased 3 years before I even met her son. She stood there with this smug smile, holding the new keys like trophies, telling me I needed to earn my place back in this family. What she didn't know was that I'd been quietly documenting her financial exploitation of my husband for months. The property deed was in my name alone, and I just discovered something that would change everything, not just about the house, but about the entire foundation of lies she'd built around our marriage. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals come from those who underestimate exactly who they're dealing with. If you've ever felt powerless against family manipulation, you'll want to hear what happened next. The car ride home from the hospital felt like a dream. Emma, my 3-day-old daughter, slept peacefully in her car seat while David drove with the careful precision of a new father. I clutched my discharge papers, a tangible reminder that the nightmare of labor complications was finally over. After 36 hours of touch-and-go moments, we were finally bringing our miracle home. "I can't wait to show Emma her nursery," David said softly, glancing at me with tired but happy eyes. Mom texted that she finished organizing everything. While we were gone, a small alarm bell rang in my mind. His mother, Patricia, had been unusually helpful during my pregnancy, insisting on having a key for emergencies. At the time, it seemed reasonable. Now, exhausted and emotionally raw, I just wanted to collapse into my own bed. We pulled into our driveway at 2847 Maple Street, my house. Purchased 3 years before I'd even met David, the Victorian-style home had been my pride and joy, a symbol of everything I'd worked for as a real estate attorney. I'd saved every penny, negotiated the price down myself, and signed that deed with trembling hands. Knowing I was finally independent, David gathered our bags while I carefully lifted Emma from her car seat. That's when I noticed something wrong. The brass deadbolt on our front door looked different, newer, shinier. My exhausted brain tried to process this detail as David approached with his key. "That's strange," he muttered, inserting the key. It wouldn't turn. He tried again, jiggling it. Nothing. Before I could respond, the door swung open from the inside. Patricia stood there, perfectly dressed at 2 in the afternoon, holding a set of keys like some twisted, welcoming committee. "Oh, good, you're finally home," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I was wondering when you'd get here. Mom, what's going on?" "My key doesn't work," David said, confusion evident in his voice. Patricia's smile was sharp as a blade. "Well, I thought it was time for some changes around here. You know, with the baby coming and all, I had the locks changed for security reasons." I stared at her, my arms tightening protectively around Emma. "You changed the locks on my house, your house." Patricia laughed, a cold sound that made my blood run cold. "Honey, I think you're confused. This is my son's house, and as his mother, I have every right to ensure it's secure for my granddaughter." The audacity was breathtaking. I'd just given birth to her granddaughter, had barely slept in 3 days, and she was playing power games with my own home. But what struck me most was her absolute confidence. She genuinely believed she had the right to do this. "Laraine, you look exhausted," Patricia continued, not moving from the doorway. "Maybe you should think about what's best for the baby. A stable home environment requires certain standards." David looked between us, clearly uncomfortable but saying nothing. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about locks. This was about control. Patricia had calculated this moment perfectly, catching me at my most vulnerable. Using my own child as leverage. As I stood there holding my newborn daughter, unable to enter my own home, I felt something shift inside me. The legal mind that had gotten me through law school, that had helped me buy this house, that had made me successful. It was waking up. And Patricia had just made the biggest mistake of her life. "We need to talk," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. Patricia's smile widened. "Of course, dear. But first, let me explain how things are going to work around here." She had no idea what she just unleashed. Standing on my own front porch, locked out like a stranger, I felt the familiar weight of the truth Patricia didn't know. Hidden in my home office in a fireproof safe she'd never even seen, sat the original property deed, a document that would shatter her delusions of control. I'd purchased 2847 Maple Street 3 years before I met David, back when I was 29. And finally earning enough as a junior partner to afford something of my own. The house had been a foreclosure, neglected but structurally sound, with good bones and endless potential. I'd spent months researching the neighborhood, running comps, negotiating with the bank dot. The day I signed those papers was one of the proudest of my life. I remember sitting in the title company office, my hands shaking as I wrote check after check, down payment, closing costs, inspection fees. Every dollar represented late nights studying for the bar exam, weekend work, sacrifice vacations. When the notary handed me those keys, I cried. "This is yours," she'd said with a smile. "Congratulations, Miss Stephenson." Miss Stephenson, not Mrs. Anyone. Just me on my own merit, with my own money. Buying my own future. I'd been so careful about keeping the deed in my name alone. Even after David and I got serious, even after we got engaged, I kept it that way. My real estate attorney brain had insisted on it. Protect yourself, always have an exit strategy. I'd seen too many women lose everything in messy divorces. Too many clients who'd assumed love meant automatic shared ownership. David had understood, or so I thought. We discussed it during our engagement, how the house would remain mine legally, but would become our home emotionally. He'd seemed genuinely supportive, even proud of my independence. "I love that you're so smart about this stuff," he'd said. I never would have thought to protect myself like that. Now, watching Patricia's smug face as she dangled those new keys, I realized she'd probably never even asked David about the deed. She'd simply assumed that marriage meant automatic property rights, that sons inherited their father's roles as household heads. In her mind, David owned the house, and by extension, she had authority over it. The assumption was so wrong, it was almost laughable. Almost. I'd spent the last 2 years watching Patricia's relationship with David, cataloging the subtle ways she maintained control. She'd co-signed his car loan, keeping her name on the title, just in case. She'd convinced him to keep a joint checking account from his college years for emergencies. She'd systematically inserted herself into every major financial decision he made, but she'd never inserted herself into mine. The house stood as proof of everything I'd built before David entered my life. I'd chosen the paint colors, installed the hardwood floors, renovated the kitchen. I'd obtained every permit, hired every contractor, made every decision. My name was on the mortgage, the insurance, the utilities, everything. Patricia's fatal error was assuming that her son's marriage had automatically transferred ownership to him. In her generation, maybe that's how it worked. But this was my house, bought with my money, in my name, protected by my foresight. Standing there with Emma in my arms, I felt the power of that truth settling over me like armor. Patricia could change the locks, make demands, play her games, but at the end of the day, she was trespassing on my property. Every moment she stood in that doorway, every second she prevented me from entering. She was committing a crime. The irony was delicious. She thought she was teaching me a lesson about family hierarchy and respect. Instead, she was about to learn a lesson about property law and the consequences of underestimating a tired, angry attorney who'd just been pushed too far. "Are you going to let us in, or do I need to call a locksmith?" I asked, my voice carrying the first hint of steel. Patricia's smile faltered slightly. Laraine, dear, I think you're not understanding the situation here. Oh, I understand perfectly, I said, shifting Emma to one arm and reaching for my phone with the other. The question is, do you? The deed in my safe wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a weapon, and Patricia had just handed me the perfect reason to use it. 3 years ago, I'd been perfectly content with my life. My law practice was thriving, my house was becoming the sanctuary I'd always dreamed of, and I was finally feeling like I'd found my footing as an independent woman. Then David walked into my office on a rainy Tuesday morning, and everything changed. He was representing a client in a property dispute, a boundary issue that required specialized real estate law expertise. From the moment he shook my hand, I was struck by his genuine warmth and the way he seemed to actually listen when I spoke. In a profession full of egos and bluster, David was refreshingly humble, asking thoughtful questions and taking careful notes. I have to admit, he said with a self-deprecating smile, property law was never my strongest subject. I'm much better with family court and custody issues. We worked together for 3 weeks on his client's case, and I found myself looking forward to our meetings. David was funny, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in my perspective on things. He brought coffee the good kind and always asked about my weekend plans. When we finally won the case, he insisted on taking me to dinner to celebrate. It's the least I can do, he said. You saved my client's property and probably my reputation. That dinner led to another, then movies, then long walks through the historic district where I bought my house. David was fascinated by my renovation stories, encouraging me to show him every detail of the work I'd done. He seemed genuinely impressed by my independence and financial savvy. Most people our age are still renting apartments, he said one evening as we sat on my newly refinished porch. You bought a house, renovated it yourself, built a successful practice. That's incredible. What I didn't realize then was how much his admiration was tinged with something else, relief, perhaps, or desperation. David's financial situation, I learned gradually, was far more precarious than his professional success suggested. He graduated law school with crushing debt, had struggled to build his practice, and was still paying off loans that should have been cleared years ago. I'm not great with money, he admitted one night, laughing nervously. I leave all that stuff to my mom. She's been handling my finances since college. Red flag number one, though I dismissed it at the time. He was 31 years old, a successful attorney, and his mother was still managing his money. But David explained it so reasonably. Patricia had been an accountant before retirement. She understood investments better than he did. It was just easier to let her handle the complicated stuff. I met Patricia 3 months into our relationship at a family barbecue that felt more like a job interview. She was polite but assessing, asking pointed questions about my background, my family's financial situation, my career plans. I noticed how David deferred to her judgment on everything from the dinner menu to his weekend plans. She's just protective, he explained later when I gently mentioned it. After my dad died, she focused everything on making sure I succeeded. She's never really learned to let go. Red flag number 2, but David's devotion to his mother seemed sweet rather than concerning. He called her daily, included her in most of our plans, and spoke about her with genuine affection. I admired his loyalty, even as I noticed how it sometimes meant our plans came second to her needs. The engagement photo sitting on my nightstand captured that hopeful time perfectly. David and I are laughing at something off camera, my hand resting on his chest, showing off the simple but elegant ring he'd chosen. We look happy in love, ready to build a life together. What the photo doesn't show is Patricia in the background, orchestrating the photo shoot, suggesting poses, making sure she approved of every shot. Even that moment, our engagement announcement, had been subtly managed by her. She'd insisted on hiring a professional photographer, choosing the location, even approving my dress. "You want to look perfect for the family newsletter," she'd said, and I'd laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't joking. The wedding planning was when the pattern became impossible to ignore. Patricia had opinions about everything: the venue, the flowers, the guest list, even my dress. She'd somehow positioned herself as the mother of the bride, despite my own mother being very much alive and involved. "It's just easier to let her handle it," David would say whenever I expressed frustration. "She's good at this stuff and she really enjoys it." But it wasn't about enjoyment, it was about control. Patricia needed to be the center of every major decision, the final authority on what was acceptable. She'd smile and call me "dear" while systematically undermining my choices, always with David's unconscious support. The wedding photo on my dresser shows us cutting the cake, both smiling proudly. But if you look closely, you can see Patricia's reflection in the silver cake server, watching, monitoring, making sure we were performing our roles correctly. I convinced myself that marriage would change things, that David would naturally start prioritizing our household over his mother's demands. I'd imagined that becoming parents would force him to establish boundaries, to protect our family's independence. Looking back now, holding Emma while locked out of my own home, I realized how naive I'd been. Patricia hadn't been preparing to let go, she'd been preparing to expand her control. The sweet, involved mother-in-law had been studying us, learning our weaknesses, positioning herself for exactly this moment. David stood beside me now, confused and uncomfortable, still looking to his mother for cues about how to handle this crisis. 34 years old, a father, and he was still waiting for Patricia to tell him what to do. The man I'd fallen in love with was still in there somewhere, but he was buried under decades of manipulation and conditioning. The question was whether he'd find the strength to fight his way out, or whether Patricia's control would cost him everything that actually mattered. The financial statements I discovered 6 months ago told a story that made my stomach turn. Hidden in David's desk drawer, underneath old tax returns, were bank statements that revealed the true scope of Patricia's control over her son's life. I found them by accident while looking for our joint insurance policy. David had mentioned keeping important documents in his desk, but when I opened the drawer, I found something else entirely: 3 years' worth of statements for accounts I didn't even know existed. The primary account was a joint checking account, opened when David was 18, presumably for college expenses. Patricia's name was listed first, with full access and authority. What shocked me wasn't just that the account still existed, it was how actively it was being used. Monthly transfers caught my eye immediately. Large sums flowing from David's paycheck account into this joint account, then smaller amounts flowing back out. Sometimes the money went to Patricia's personal account. Sometimes it disappeared into cash withdrawals. Always there were fees overdraft, charges when David's account ran low, transfer fees, maintenance charges that could have been avoided with better planning, but the pattern was what made everything clear. David would deposit his paycheck. Patricia would transfer most of it to the joint account for safekeeping, then dole it back to him in smaller amounts as needed. It was an allowance system dressed up as financial management. "She's helping me save," David had explained when I finally worked up the courage to ask about it. "I've never been good with budgets, and she makes sure I don't overspend." At 34 years old, my husband was receiving an allowance from his mother. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing it became. Patricia had convinced David to take out loans for things he couldn't afford: a new car, home improvements, even our honeymoon with her as co-signer. In theory, this was helpful support. In practice, it meant she had legal claims on everything he owned and every major purchase required her approval. The car was the perfect example. David had wanted something reliable but modest: a used Honda or a Toyota that would serve his needs without breaking the budget. Patricia had insisted he deserved better, had found a BMW lease deal that wasn't much more per month, and had co-signed the paperwork before he could object. Of course, wasn't much more. Turned out to be nearly double what he'd planned to spend, and the insurance costs were astronomical. When David struggled to make the payments, Patricia would step in with loans from their joint account, further deepening his dependence on her financial management. I'd seen this pattern before in my legal practice: financial abuse disguised as family support. The victim becomes gradually more dependent, their autonomy eroded through seemingly helpful gestures that come with strings attached. The abuser maintains control by creating situations where their help becomes necessary for survival, but Patricia was cleverer than most. She'd structured everything to look legitimate, even generous. She wasn't stealing from David technically. She was managing his money, making investments on his behalf, ensuring his financial security. The fact that this management kept him perpetually dependent was just a coincidence, surely. The family dynamic reinforced this control beautifully. David's older brother, Mark, had escaped by moving across the country and cutting financial ties completely. He called on holidays and sent Christmas cards, but maintained strict boundaries about money and decision-making. Patricia spoke about him with obvious disappointment. He was successful but distant, independent but ungrateful. David's younger sister, Sarah, had taken the opposite approach, embracing her role as Patricia's dependent and confidant. She lived in a condo Patricia had helped her buy, worked at a job Patricia had helped her find, and called her mother daily for advice on everything from grocery shopping to dating. Patricia spoke about Sarah with obvious pride. She was responsible, family-oriented, properly grateful for support. David fell somewhere in between, and Patricia worked constantly to keep him there, independent enough to feel like a man, but dependent enough to need her guidance. Successful enough to contribute to the family finances, but never quite stable enough to reject her help. The wedding had been the perfect example. Patricia had insisted on contributing to the costs, a generous gesture that any reasonable person would appreciate. But her contributions came with expectations about vendors, guest lists, and ceremony details. When David tried to assert his preferences, she'd remind him gently about how much money she was investing in his special day. "I just want everything to be perfect for you both," she'd say, implying that disagreeing with her choices meant settling for something less than perfect. I'd watch David struggle with these dynamics throughout our relationship, never quite understanding what he was fighting against. He'd make decisions independently, then second-guess himself when Patricia expressed concern. He'd assert his preferences, then back down when she explained why her suggestions were better. "She's just trying to help," he'd say after particularly frustrating interactions. "She's been doing this longer than we have." But the bank statements revealed the truth behind the help. Every financial decision David made was filtered through Patricia's approval. She knew exactly how much money he earned, where it went, what he could afford. She had access to his credit report, his loan applications, his investment accounts. She knew more about his financial situation than his own wife did. The most chilling discovery was a life insurance policy. I'd never heard of a term life policy with Patricia as the sole beneficiary. The premiums were automatically deducted from their joint account, so David probably forgot it existed. But Patricia was quietly paying to insure her son's life, ensuring that even his death would provide her with financial benefit. When I tried to discuss these concerns with David, he became defensive and confused. This was just how his family operated: supportive, involved, financially responsible. Patricia had helped him through law school, had co-signed loans when his credit was poor, had provided stability during uncertain times. How could I criticize someone who'd sacrificed so much for his success? But that was exactly the problem. Patricia's sacrifices weren't gifts, they were investments in control. Every dollar she spent on David's behalf was a string attached to His autonomy, a lever she could use to influence his decisions. The more she helped, the more he owed her. The more he owed her, the less he could afford to disappoint her. Standing on my porch now, watching her wave those new keys like a queen granting audience, I saw the culmination of decades of financial manipulation. Patricia had trained David to defer to her authority, to assume she knew best, to prioritize her comfort over his own judgment. She just made one critical error in her calculations. She'd assumed the house was part of David's financial world, therefore part of her domain. She'd never considered that her daughter-in-law might have assets and authority completely outside her sphere of influence. The property deed in my safe wasn't just legal documentation, it was proof that some things in this family were beyond Patricia's control, and I was about to teach her exactly what that meant. My pregnancy journal sits hidden in my nightstand drawer, filled with thoughts I couldn't share with anyone, especially not David. The entries started hopeful, documenting morning sickness and doctor's appointments. But as the months progressed, they became a record of growing unease about Patricia's behavior. 12. Patricia insisted on coming to today's ultrasound appointment. She cried when we heard the heartbeat, which was sweet, but then she immediately started making plans for the nursery. When I mentioned we wanted to wait to know the gender, she said, "Oh, we'll find out. I need to know for shopping. We need." Week 16. Patricia brought over paint samples today without asking. She's decided the nursery should be yellow since we're being stubborn about learning the gender. When I said I was thinking about soft green, she laughed and said yellow was more traditional. David just nodded along. I feel like I'm disappearing. Week 20. The anatomy scan revealed we're having a girl. Patricia's reaction was immediate. She started talking about ballet classes, beauty pageants, and raising a proper young lady. When I mentioned wanting Emma to grow up strong and independent, Patricia's smile got tight. Of course, dear, but femininity is important too. I wanted to scream. Reading those entries now, I can see the pattern I was too exhausted to recognize at the time. Patricia wasn't excited about becoming a grandmother. She was excited about having a new person to control. Every conversation about the baby became an opportunity for her to establish authority over decisions that should have been mine and David's alone. The baby shower was where things really escalated. I'd wanted something small and intimate, maybe at a restaurant with close friends and family. Patricia had other ideas. Nonsense, she'd said when David mentioned my preferences. This is my first granddaughter. We're going to do this properly. Before I could object, she'd booked the church fellowship hall, invited people I'd never met, and planned a menu I didn't even like. When I tried to discuss it with David, he just looked tired. She's excited, Laraine. Let her have this. It's not worth fighting about, but it wasn't just about the shower, it was about precedent. If Patricia could unilaterally plan my baby shower, what else would she decide about Emma's life? Birthday parties, school choices, extracurricular activities. Week 28, Patricia showed up with a car seat today. Not asked if we needed one, not offered to help us shop for one, just brought one and installed it in David's car. It's a nice one, expensive, but it's not the one we researched and wanted. When I pointed this out, she said, "Well, you can return that one and get your money back. This one has better safety ratings." She'd already cut the tags off. The car seat incident was a turning point. Patricia had literally taken control of my baby's safety equipment, making unilateral decisions about something as fundamental as how we'd transport our child. When I tried to explain to David why this was problematic, he accused me of being ungrateful. She spent $300 on a car seat, Laraine. She's trying to help, but we already bought one. We researched it for weeks, so now we have two. What's the problem? The problem was that Patricia was systematically inserting herself into every decision about our daughter, establishing patterns that would be impossible to break once Emma arrived. But David couldn't see it or wouldn't see it. Week 32. Patricia has a key to her house now. David gave it to her for emergencies. Without asking me, she used it yesterday to let herself in while I was at work, supposedly to clean the nursery. I came home to find she'd rearranged everything, moved the crib, rehung pictures, even changed the curtains I'd hung last weekend. When I asked David about it, he said she was just excited and wanted to help. I feel like I'm going crazy. Key was the line I didn't know she'd already crossed. In Patricia's mind, having access to her home meant having authority over it. She'd started small, doing laundry, organizing closets, cleaning things that didn't need cleaning. But each intrusion was training David to accept her presence as normal and necessary. Week 35. Hospital tour today. Patricia came with us, which I didn't expect. She asked more questions than David and I combined about visiting hours, parking, overnight policies. When the nurse explained that only 2 people could be in the delivery room during labor, Patricia immediately said, "Well, that'll be me and David, obviously." I said actually it would be David and me and maybe my mother. Patricia looked genuinely shocked, like it had never occurred to her that she wouldn't be automatically included. That was the moment I realized Patricia saw herself as an equal parent in this situation. Not a grandmother, not a supportive family member, a co-parent with the same rights and authority as David and me. The expression on her face when I claimed my own space in my daughter's birth was pure incredulity. 37. Patricia brought over newborn clothes today, dozens of outfits. All in pink with sayings like Grandma's Girl and Princess in Training. When I mentioned that we'd been buying more neutral colors and practical items, she waved me off. "Babies need to look like babies," she said. "All that neutral stuff is just trendy nonsense." She'd also bought a bassinet for her house for when Emma stays over. Emma isn't even born yet, and Patricia is already planning sleepovers. The clothes and bassinet were declarations of ownership. Patricia was establishing her claim on Emma's time, her right to dress Emma according to her preferences, her authority to override my parenting choices. The stays over comment was particularly chilling. She was already planning to separate Emma from me on a regular basis. Week 39. Labor started this morning. Contractions are irregular but getting stronger. David is nervous, sweet, asking what I need. Patricia has called 3 times in the last hour, wanting updates. She's insisting on being at the hospital in case something happens. I told David I want just him with me during delivery, and my mom can come after Emma is born. He agreed, but I can tell he's dreading telling his mother she can't be there for the birth. The labor entries are shaky, written between contractions, full of fear and anticipation. What I couldn't have known then was that Patricia was already making her own plans for my absence. While I was focused on bringing Emma safely into the world, Patricia was focused on establishing her dominance in our home. Day 2 in hospital. Emma is perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, healthy lungs. David is completely smitten, barely wants to put her down. Patricia has been to visit twice, bringing flowers and advice. She keeps offering to help out at home when we're discharged, but something about the way she says it makes me uncomfortable. Maybe I'm just hormonal and exhausted. Day 3. Going home today. Can't wait to start our new life as a family. Emma slept for 3 hours straight last night. Hopefully that's a good sign. Patricia texted that she's prepared everything for our homecoming. I assumed she meant maybe she'd stocked the fridge or something nice. Like that dot reading those final entries now, I can see how naive I was. Patricia hadn't prepared a welcome home surprise. She'd prepared a coup. While I was focused on recovery and bonding with Emma, she was busy changing locks and establishing territorial control over my own house. The pregnancy journal documented 9 months of escalating boundary violations, each one small enough to dismiss individually, but together forming a clear pattern of someone who saw my daughter as her possession and my role as negotiable. Standing here now, locked out of my own home with Emma in my arms, those journal entries felt like prophecy. Patricia hadn't been excited about becoming a grandmother. She'd been preparing to become the primary mother figure in Emma's life, with me relegated to a supporting role in my own family. But she'd miscalculated in one crucial way. All those months of watching her manipulate David, document her behavior, and prepare for this exact moment hadn't been wasted. I had evidence, I had legal standing, and I had finally reached my limit. The real question was whether David would finally see what I'd been documenting all along, or whether he'd continue to make excuses for behavior that was about to cost him everything. The joint account records I'd printed and hidden in my office. Safe told a story of systematic theft disguised as family support. What I'd initially dismissed as overly involved financial management was actually something much darker, a decades long pattern of financial abuse that would make any prosecutor salivate. It started with small discrepancies I noticed while helping David organize our taxes. He'd mentioned feeling like his paychecks never seemed to stretch as far as they should, despite earning a good living as an attorney. When I offered to look at his budget, he'd seemed almost relieved. "Mom usually handles this stuff," he'd said, handing me a shoebox full of statements, but maybe a fresh perspective would help. The first thing I noticed was the complexity. David had 7 different accounts: checking, savings, investment, retirement, and 3 joint accounts with Patricia. For someone who claimed to be bad with money, this seemed like unnecessary complication. The second thing I noticed was the pattern of transfers. Every month, David's paycheck would be deposited into his primary checking account. Within 24 hours, Patricia would transfer large portions to their joint accounts for savings and investment purposes. Then, throughout the month, smaller amounts would flow back to David's account as needed, but the math didn't add up. David earned $8,500 per month. After taxes and insurance, his take-home was roughly $6,200. According to the statements, Patricia was transferring an average of $4,800 per month to their joint accounts. That left David with $1,400 for all his personal expenses, rent on his old apartment before we moved in together, car payment, student loans, food, gas, everything. No wonder he'd always seemed financially stressed. I pulled statements going back 3 years and started tracking the money flows in detail. What I found was staggering. Over 36 months, Patricia had transferred $172,800 from David's account to accounts she controlled. But the money flowing back to David totaled only $9,840,074,400 had simply vanished. When I asked David about specific transactions, his answers were vague and confused. The $5,000 withdrawal in March was for home improvements on Mom's house. The $8,200 transfer in July was an investment opportunity she found. The monthly $800 transfers were building an emergency fund for the family. But when I asked to see documentation, receipts, investment statements, savings account balances, David couldn't produce anything. "Mom keeps all that organized," he'd say. "She's got everything filed at her house." I started requesting statements directly from the banks, using the account numbers from David's paperwork. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The joint savings account that was supposedly building, David's emergency fund, had a current balance of $247 after 3 years of $800. Monthly transfers, nearly $29,000. There was essentially nothing. The investment account showed similar problems. Patricia had been moving money in and out regularly, but the net balance never grew significantly. When I traced specific transactions, I found that she'd been transferring money from David's investment account to cover her personal expenses, mortgage payments, car repairs, vacation costs. The home improvement account was the most blatant theft. Patricia had been taking money from David ostensibly for repairs and upgrades to her house, improvements that would benefit him when he eventually inherited the property. But when I drove by Patricia's house, I saw no evidence of significant recent improvements. The same dated siding, same old driveway, same worn roof that had been there for years. I spent weeks documenting everything, creating spreadsheets that tracked every transaction, every transfer, every supposed investment. The pattern was consistent and damning. Patricia was systematically stealing from her son while convincing him she was helping manage his finances. But the most disturbing discovery came when I accessed David's credit report. Patricia had been opening accounts in his name, using her access to his personal information and their joint financial history. A credit card here, a small loan there, always with reasonable explanations about building credit or handling emergencies. The credit card had a $15,000 limit and a current balance of $12,847. The monthly statements were being sent to Patricia's address, so David didn't even know the card existed. When I looked at the transaction history, I found charges for grocery stores near Patricia's house, gas stations she used, even a vacation rental in Florida that coincided with a trip she'd taken last winter. She was living off David's credit. While he struggled to make ends meet on the allowance she doled back to him, the small loans were equally problematic. Patricia had co-signed for what she called emergency funds, $5,000 here, $3,000 there, but the money never went to emergencies. According to the bank records, these loans were immediately transferred to Patricia's personal accounts and used for her regular expenses. David was unknowingly paying for his mother's lifestyle, while believing he was too financially irresponsible to manage his own money. The documentation process took months. I had to be careful not to alert Patricia to what I was discovering, so I worked slowly, requesting historical statements, building a comprehensive picture of the financial abuse. Every evening after work, I'd spend hours organizing evidence, calculating totals, building the case that would eventually destroy her. The final tally was staggering. Over the past 3 years alone, Patricia had stolen or misappropriated more than $127,000 from David. When I extrapolated back to include his early career years, the total probably exceeded $300,000. She'd stolen the down payment for a house, the money for a decent car, the security of a proper emergency fund. She'd kept him financially dependent by literally stealing his financial independence, but she'd also committed multiple felonies in the process. Identity theft for opening accounts without proper authorization, wire fraud for misrepresenting the purpose of transfers. Elder abuse statutes might even apply, given her position of trust and authority over David's finances. A prosecutor with this evidence could probably secure convictions on a dozen different charges. I made copies of everything, organized the evidence into clear categories, and prepared a comprehensive report that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Then I locked it all in my office safe, waiting for the right moment to reveal what I discovered. That moment was approaching faster than I'd expected. Patricia's behavior during my pregnancy had become increasingly controlling and intrusive. The lock change was just the culmination of years of escalating boundary violations and power grabs. But now I had something Patricia didn't know existed: proof of her crimes, documented in her own financial records, impossible to deny or rationalize. Away. The woman standing in my doorway, smiling smugly while preventing me from entering my own home, had no idea that I held the power to send her to prison. She thought she was teaching me a lesson about family hierarchy and respect. Instead, she was about to learn a lesson about consequences and criminal liability. And unlike her victim, I had the legal expertise to make sure justice was served completely and properly. The hospital security footage would later show exactly what Patricia did while I was fighting for my life in the delivery room. But in the moment, focused on bringing Emma safely into the world, I had no idea that my mother-in-law was already executing her plan to take control of our family. Labor had started at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 days before my due date. The contractions were intense from the beginning, coming every few minutes with the kind of pain that makes you understand why women used to die in childbirth. David was perfect holding my hand, timing contractions, advocating with the nurses. When I needed pain relief, Patricia arrived at the hospital within an hour of getting David's call. Despite being told that only David would be allowed in the delivery room, she settled into the waiting area like she was planning to stay for days, armed with magazines, snacks, and a phone charger. "I'll just wait here until my granddaughter arrives," she announced to anyone who would listen. "First grandchild, you know, very exciting." The labor progressed slowly, then suddenly became complicated. Emma's heart rate dropped during contractions, and the doctors started using terms like fetal distress and emergency cesarean. What should have been a natural delivery became a medical crisis, with David holding my hand while I was rushed into surgery. According to the hospital's visitor log, Patricia left the building at 2:30 p.m., claiming she was going home to prepare for the homecoming. At the time, I was unconscious under general anesthesia, and David was focused entirely on Emma and my recovery. Neither of us thought to question why she was leaving during such a critical time. The security footage from our neighborhood later revealed the truth. Patricia arrived at our house at 3:15 p.m., letting herself in with the key David had given her. Months earlier, she wasn't alone. She'd brought a locksmith. Over the next 4 hours, while I was recovering from surgery and learning to breastfeed Emma, Patricia was systematically changing every lock on our house. Front door, back door, basement door, even the garage. She paid the locksmith in cash and requested that all the old locks be disposed of completely, but that wasn't all she did. The footage showed her making multiple trips to her car, bringing in boxes and bags. She spent considerable time in the nursery rearranging furniture and replacing items we'd chosen with things she'd brought. The mobile David and I had carefully selected was replaced with one featuring ballet dancers. The gender-neutral wall art was replaced with pink princess themes. She'd also brought cleaning supplies and spent hours scrubbing the house from top to bottom, not because it was dirty, but because she was marking her territory. Every surface was wiped down with her preferred products, every room reorganized according to her standards. Most disturbing was what she did in our bedroom. Patricia spent over an hour going through our personal belongings, opening drawers, looking through closets, examining documents and paperwork. She was clearly searching for something, though I wouldn't understand what until much later. The locksmith finished his work at 7:45 p.m., and Patricia paid him an additional cash tip for discretion about the timing. She then spent another hour testing each lock, practicing with the new keys, ensuring everything worked perfectly by 8:30 p.m. Patricia had completely secured our house against our return. But she wasn't finished. The final piece of footage showed her in our kitchen, making herself dinner using our food, then settling onto our couch to watch television. She was spending the night in our house, sleeping in our guest room, establishing occupancy while we were trapped at the hospital. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, David and I were focused entirely on Emma and my recovery. The C-section had been more complicated than expected, and I've lost significant blood. The doctors wanted to monitor both Emma and me for at least 48 hours before discharge. Patricia visited the next day, bringing flowers and acting like the concerned grandmother. She held Emma, cooed over her, and expressed appropriate sympathy for my difficult delivery. When David mentioned being eager to get home, she was quick to offer help. "Don't worry about anything at home," she said with a smile that I now recognize as predatory. I've been keeping an eye on things. Everything will be perfect when you bring Emma home. I was too exhausted and medicated to read the subtext, but Patricia was already savoring her victory. She'd calculated the timing, perfectly waiting until I was most vulnerable, most dependent on others, least able to fight back or think clearly. The second night in the hospital, Patricia visited again, this time bringing a suitcase. I thought I'd stay over tonight, she announced. You know, in case you need anything or if there are problems with the baby. David looked confused. Stay over where? The hospital doesn't have accommodations for extended family. Oh, not here, Patricia laughed at the house. I'll stay at your house tonight, just to be close by in case of emergencies. Something about the way she said, your house, should have triggered alarm bells. But I was focused on Emma's feeding schedule and my own pain management. David just nodded, grateful for what seemed like thoughtful support Patricia was spending. Her second night in our house, further establishing her claim to the space and solidifying her sense of ownership. By the time we were discharged, she'd been living there for 3 days, sleeping in her guest room, cooking in her kitchen, watching our television in her mind. She wasn't trespassing, she was managing the family home during a crisis. She'd convinced herself that her actions were necessary and helpful, that David and I would be grateful for her initiative once we understood how much work she'd done. The morning of our discharge, Patricia called to check on our departure time. I'll have everything ready for Emma's arrival, she said. I've been preparing all week. Preparing what? I asked, finally alert enough to notice the odd phrasing. Oh, just making sure the house is perfect for the baby. You'll see. I think you'll be very pleased with the improvements. Improvements, not help, not assistance improvements. She'd improved our house while we were gone, according to her own standards and preferences. The drive home was the last peaceful moment I'd have for months. Emma slept quietly in her car seat. David hummed softly while driving, and I allowed myself to imagine settling into our own space with our new daughter. I pictured the nursery we'd prepared together, the routine we'd planned, the quiet weeks of bonding and adjustment that every new family needs. I was thinking about breastfeeding schedules and sleep patterns, about introducing Emma to her new home. I wasn't thinking about locks or keys or territorial battles. I wasn't prepared for the possibility that someone else had claimed authority over our most intimate family space. As we pulled into our driveway, I felt nothing but gratitude and relief. We were home. We were safe. We could finally begin our life as a family of 3. Patricia's car was already there, parked in our driveway, like she belonged there. At the time, I assumed she was just visiting to welcome Emma home. I had no idea she'd been living there for 3 days, or that she'd systematically prepared to prevent our entry. The woman who greeted us at the door wasn't a helpful grandmother offering support. She was an occupying force who'd spent 72 hours establishing dominance over our territory. And she was about to discover that she'd chosen the wrong house and the wrong woman to mess with. Standing on my own front porch, holding my 3-day-old daughter while my mother-in-law blocked entry to my legally owned property, my legal training kicked into overdrive. Every instinct honed through years of real estate law and courtroom experience was cataloging the crimes being committed in real time. Trespassing was the most obvious charge. Patricia had no legal right to be in my house, regardless of her relationship to David. The key David had given her was for emergencies, not for unauthorized occupancy. By changing the locks and refusing me entry, she'd essentially stolen my property and was now unlawfully detaining it. But trespassing was just the beginning. Breaking and entering could apply. Even though she'd initially had permission to enter, by changing the locks without authorization, she'd exceeded the scope of her permitted access and was now unlawfully controlling the premises. The fact that she'd brought a locksmith proved premeditation. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. But a calculated plan to seize control, criminal mischief, was another clear violation. Changing locks without the owner's permission constitutes deliberate damage to property, even if the locks themselves were improved. She'd altered my security systems without authorization, potentially compromising my homeowner's insurance and definitely violating local building codes. The timing made everything worse. Targeting someone who'd just given birth, who is physically recovering from surgery, who is caring for a newborn, that added elements of vulnerable adult abuse to the charges. Patricia had deliberately chosen my most defenseless moment to execute her plan, but the really serious charges stemmed from her financial crimes, which I'd been documenting for months. Identity theft for opening credit accounts in David's name. Wire fraud for misrepresenting the purpose of fund transfers. Forgery if she'd signed David's name on any documents. Elder financial abuse, given her position of trust and the systematic nature of the theft. I mentally calculated the dollar amounts involved. The credit card debt alone exceeded $12,000, putting it in felony territory. The total theft over 3 years approached $130,000, which would carry serious prison time. At the property crimes she was committing right now, and Patricia was looking at multiple felony convictions, the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, credit reports, hospital security footage, witness statements from the locksmith. Any prosecutor would see this as a slam dunk case with clear documentation and obvious criminal intent, but pursuing criminal charges was only one option. Civil litigation offered additional remedies that might be more immediately effective. Could file for immediate injunctive relief, forcing Patricia to return my keys and vacate my property within hours. The property deed in my safe would make that motion uncontestable. No judge would allow someone to occupy another person's home without permission. Damages would be substantial. The cost of changing locks again, security system upgrades, lost. Wages from dealing with this crisis, emotional distress from being targeted during postpartum recovery. I could probably claim $50,000 in compensatory damages without breaking a sweat. Punitive damages were where things got interesting. The deliberate timing, the systematic nature of the financial abuse, the violation of my most vulnerable moment, all of that pointed toward the kind of egregious conduct that justifies punitive awards. In the right jurisdiction, with the right jury, I could potentially recover hundreds of thousands in punitive damages, but the most powerful tool was probably a restraining order. Patricia's pattern of escalating boundary violations, combined with her current unlawful behavior, would easily support a protection order that would keep her away from Emma, our house, and our family permanently. The restraining order could include provisions about financial contact, too. I could force her to return David's stolen money, close the unauthorized accounts, and remove herself from all of his financial affairs. The court could essentially order Patricia to undo 20 years of financial manipulation. Standing there analyzing my legal options, I felt a sense of calm settling over me. Patricia thought she held all the power in this situation. She thought her maternal authority, her financial control over David, and her physical possession of my house gave her unassailable leverage. She had no idea that she'd just committed multiple felonies in front of an attorney who specialized in exactly the kind of property disputes that would destroy her. Real estate law is about more than buying and selling houses. It's about the fundamental rights that come with property. Ownership. The right to exclude others, the right to control access, the right to make decisions about your own space. Patricia had violated every one of those rights, and I had the legal expertise to make her pay for every violation. The criminal charges would probably take months to resolve, but the civil remedies could be implemented immediately. A competent judge could have Patricia out of my house and under a restraining order within 24 hours. The financial restitution might take longer, but I could freeze her assets and place liens on her property to ensure eventual collection. I thought about Patricia's house, her car, her bank accounts. Everything she owned could potentially be seized to satisfy judgments for the money she'd stolen from David. She could lose everything she'd accumulated through decades of financial manipulation. But beyond the legal remedies, there was something more satisfying about this situation. Patricia had chosen to play power games with someone who understood power better than she did. She'd tried to intimidate someone who spent her days in courtrooms, facing down opposing counsel and hostile witnesses. She'd brought manipulation tactics to a legal fight, and that was a mistake she'd regret for the rest of her life. The irony was perfect. Patricia had spent years controlling David through financial dependency and emotional manipulation. She'd positioned herself as the authority figure in every family decision, the final word on what was acceptable. Now she was about to discover what real authority looked like. Not the kind that came from emotional manipulation or financial control, but the kind that came from legal ownership and constitutional rights. I own this house. I had the deed, the mortgage, the insurance policies. I had the legal right to exclude anyone I chose, for any reason, at any time. Patricia's relationship to David gave her exactly zero rights to my property, and I was about to educate her about the difference between assumed authority and actual legal power. The woman standing in my doorway, smiling smugly while holding those new keys, thought she was teaching me a lesson about family dynamics and proper respect for elders. Instead, she was about to receive a masterclass in property law, criminal liability, and the serious consequences of underestimating someone with a law degree and a very detailed file of evidence documenting her crimes. The evidence file in my office safe contained more than just financial records. It was a roadmap for Patricia's complete destruction, organized with a methodical precision that had made me successful in complex property litigation. Every document was cataloged, every transaction traced, every crime documented with the kind of detail that would make prosecutors weep with joy. But timing was everything. Strike too early, and Patricia could claim ignorance or attempt to make restitution privately. Strike too late, and she might destroy evidence or manipulate David into protecting her. The lock-changing incident had given me the perfect moment. A crime committed in broad daylight, impossible to deny or rationalize away. I'd been waiting for Patricia to cross a line that even David couldn't excuse. Her financial manipulation had been subtle enough that he could convince himself it was just poor communication or overly involved family support. But locking his wife and newborn daughter out of their own home, that was unambiguous hostility that no reasonable person could defend. The beauty of this moment was that Patricia had committed multiple crimes while believing she was in a position of strength. She thought David's dependency and my postpartum vulnerability made her untouchable. She had no idea that I'd been building a case against her for months, waiting for exactly this kind of overreach. My strategy had 3 phases, each designed to maximize impact while protecting my family from retaliation. Phase 1 was immediate relief, getting back into my house and establishing clear legal boundaries. I had the property deed in my safe, which would make short work of any question about who belonged here. But I also wanted Patricia's acknowledgement of wrongdoing, preferably recorded. That would support both criminal and civil charges later. Phase 2 was financial justice, exposing the theft and fraud that had kept David trapped in dependency. The evidence was overwhelming, but I needed to present it carefully to help David understand the magnitude of betrayal without completely destroying him emotionally. His mother hadn't just stolen his money, she'd stolen his autonomy, his confidence, his ability to trust his own judgment. Phase 3 was long-term protection legal remedies that would prevent Patricia from ever again having this kind of control over our family. Restraining orders, criminal charges, civil judgments that would follow her for years. She needed to understand that crossing us would cost her everything she valued, but I also had to consider David's psychological state throughout this process. He'd been conditioned for 34 years to defer to his mother's authority, to assume she knew best, to prioritize her feelings over his own instincts. Revealing the scope of her betrayal too quickly could break him completely. I needed to lead him through the evidence gradually, helping him reach his own conclusions rather than forcing revelations on him. The goal wasn't just to punish Patricia, it was to free David from decades of manipulation and help him reclaim his own agency. The immediate confrontation required careful calibration. I needed to be firm enough to reclaim my property, but not so aggressive that David would instinctively move to protect his mother. Patricia was counting on his reflexive loyalty, and I couldn't afford to trigger that response before he understood what was really happening. I had my phone in my hand, ready to call the police if Patricia refused to surrender the keys voluntarily. But I also had something better legal knowledge that would let me dismantle her position piece by piece in front of David, so he could see exactly how wrong she'd been about everything. The evidence file contained documents Patricia had never seen, financial records she didn't know I'd obtained, proof of crimes she'd assumed were perfectly hidden. I could reveal each piece strategically, building a case that would become impossible to deny or explain away. But the most powerful weapon was simply the truth about property ownership. Patricia's entire power play was based on the assumption that David owned this house, giving her some derivative authority over it. When she discovered that the house was mine alone, that her son had no legal claim to it whatsoever, her entire position would collapse instantly. I could already imagine her face when I revealed the deed. The shock, the confusion, the desperate scrambling to maintain some semblance of authority. She'd probably try to claim that married couples shared property automatically, not understanding the legal distinctions between community property and separate property states. Her ignorance of property law was about to become very expensive. Confrontation also needed to serve a larger purpose, establishing new boundaries that would protect Emma from Patricia's manipulation. This wasn't just about recovering my house keys. It was about making clear that Patricia's era of unquestioned authority over our family decisions was over permanently. Every word I spoke needed to reinforce that message. Patricia was not an equal participant in our household. She was not a co-parent to Emma. She had no authority over my property, my child, or my family's decisions. The key was to remain calm and professional throughout the confrontation. Losing my temper would only give Patricia ammunition to claim I was unstable or unreasonable. Instead, I needed to channel the courtroom presence that had served me well in depositions and settlement conferences. Cool, factual, absolutely certain of my legal position. I also needed witnesses. David's presence was crucial, but I wanted more than that. I pulled out my phone and started a voice recording, making sure Patricia could see what I was doing. Any admissions she made about changing the locks, any threats or demands she issued, would be preserved for later use in court. The recording would also protect me from false accusations. Patricia might later claim I'd been threatening or abusive, trying to paint herself as the victim in the situation. Having an audio record of exactly what was said would prevent her from rewriting history to suit her narrative. Standing there, on my own porch, holding Emma while formulating my legal strategy, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete confidence in my ability to protect my family. Patricia had made a critical error by choosing to attack me in the area of my greatest expertise. She'd brought emotional manipulation to a legal fight, and that was going to cost her everything. The financial therapy worksheets scattered across our dining room table told the story of David's gradual awakening to 34 years of systematic manipulation. Dr. Rebecca Chen had recommended them after our first emergency session together, designed to help abuse survivors understand how financial control had shaped their decision-making patterns. I want you to work through these together. she'd said during that first session, 3 days after the lock incident. Financial abuse creates cognitive distortions that can take months to unpack. David needs to see the patterns objectively before he can break free from them. The worksheet started with basic questions. Who controls your bank accounts? Who makes decisions about major purchases? Who has access to your credit information? David's answers revealed how completely Patricia had inserted herself into every aspect of his financial life, but it was the timeline exercise that really opened his eyes. I sat beside him as he mapped out major financial decisions over the past decade, noting who had initiated each choice, who had provided information, who had made the final call. The pattern was stark and undeniable. Patricia's fingerprints were on every single decision. She helped me buy my first car, David said slowly, pencil hovering over the worksheet. I wanted something used and practical, but she found the Beam lease. She said it would be better for my professional image. How did that work out financially? Dr. Chun had asked. David's laugh was bitter. I could barely afford the payments. Had to borrow money from her constantly just to keep up with the insurance costs. That was the first crack in his defensive wall. The recognition that Patricia's help had actually made his life harder, not easier. Each worksheet revealed another layer of manipulation, another way she'd positioned herself as indispensable, while actually creating the problems she claimed to solve. The credit report exercise was devastating. I sat with David as he called each credit bureau, requesting his full history. When the reports arrived, he stared at them for 20 minutes, without speaking. This card, he said finally, pointing to a line item. I don't remember applying for this card. But you see the address where statements are being sent? I asked gently. Mom's house, he whispered. She's been getting statements for a card I didn't know existed. The debt analysis worksheet required listing every obligation, every monthly payment, every financial commitment. David had been living paycheck to paycheck despite earning a substantial income, but he'd never understood why. The worksheets forced him to trace every dollar, revealing how Patricia's management had created artificial scarcity. Look at this, I said, showing him the comparison chart we'd created. Your take-home pay versus your actual expenses. There should be almost $2,000 left over every month. But there never was, David said, confusion evident in his voice. I was always borrowing money for basic things. Because your mother was transferring $4,800 out of your account every month, then giving you back just enough to survive. She was keeping the difference. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. I watched as 34 years of gaslighting began to crumble, replaced by the stark reality of financial exploitation. His mother hadn't been helping him. She'd been systematically stealing from him, while convincing him he was too irresponsible to manage his own money. The psychological assessment portion was even more revealing. David scored extremely high on measures of learned helplessness and financial anxiety. His responses showed classic patterns of someone who'd been trained to doubt his own judgment and defer to external authority. She always said I was bad with money, he told Dr. Chun during our second session. Ever since college, she'd point out mistakes I made, times I overspent or forgot to pay bills. I started to believe I really couldn't handle it myself. But look at these worksheets, Dr. Chun replied. When you made independent decisions, the ones your mother wasn't involved in, how did they turn out? David studied the analysis he'd completed. His independent financial choices had actually been quite sound. He'd chosen reasonable insurance policies, made smart decisions about student loan repayment, even picked good investment options for his retirement account. It was only the decisions influenced by Patricia that had gone poorly. The revelation was transformative. David wasn't financially irresponsible, he'd been financially sabotaged. Thought the hardest worksheet dealt with emotional manipulation. David had to identify specific phrases his mother used to control his behavior, then analyze how those phrases affected his decision-making. The list was extensive and chilling. "You're just like your father, no head for business." "I'm only trying to protect you from making mistakes." "You should be grateful I'm willing to help when no one else would." "Family takes care of family, that's what love looks like." Each phrase was designed to undermine David's confidence while positioning Patricia as the benevolent authority figure. She trained him to believe that questioning her judgment was ungrateful, that making independent decisions was selfish, that needing her help proved his inadequacy, that the locks incident had shattered that programming. Even David couldn't rationalize away locking his wife and newborn daughter out of their own home. No amount of family loyalty could excuse that level of cruelty and control. "I keep thinking about Emma," he said during one of our late-night conversations over the worksheets. "What if Mom tries to do to her what she did to me? What if she convinces Emma that she can't trust her own judgment, that she needs Mom's approval for everything?" That fear became David's motivation for change. He might have accepted Patricia's control over his own life, but he wouldn't allow it to extend to his daughter. The protective instinct that should have kicked in years ago finally emerged when Emma became the target. The final worksheet required David to write a letter to himself acknowledging the abuse, accepting that it wasn't his fault, and committing to new boundaries that would protect his family. Reading that letter aloud to me and Dr. Chun was one of the most difficult things he'd ever done. "I, David Stephenson, acknowledge that my mother has been financially and emotionally abusing me for most of my adult life," he read, his voice shaking. "I accept that her behavior was wrong, that my loyalty was misplaced, and that protecting my wife and daughter requires me to stop enabling her manipulation." The worksheets had taken 6 weeks to complete, but they'd accomplished something years of gentle suggestions from me had failed to achieve. David finally understood that his mother's love had come with attached strings that had trapped him in perpetual childhood, dependent on her approval for every major decision, but understanding the abuse was only the first step. Breaking free from 34 years of conditioning would require ongoing work, consistent boundaries, and the courage to disappoint someone he'd spent his entire life trying to please. The question now was whether David had developed enough strength to stand up to Patricia when she inevitably fought back against his newfound independence. The woman who'd spent decades perfecting her control over him wouldn't surrender that power without a vicious fight. The small digital voice recorder hidden in my purse would capture everything said during the family meeting I'd carefully orchestrated. Patricia had no idea she was about to confess to multiple felonies while surrounded by witnesses who could testify to her admissions. I'd planned this meeting for 2 weeks, timing it perfectly for maximum impact. David had completed his financial therapy worksheets and was finally ready to confront his mother about the systematic theft. Patricia remained confident in her position, believing the lock incident had established her authority permanently. She had no idea that her arrogance was about to provide the final evidence needed to destroy her. "We need to have a family discussion about boundaries," I told Patricia when I called to arrange the meeting. "With Emma here now, it's important that everyone understands their role in our household." "Of course, dear," Patricia had replied, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'm glad you're finally ready to have a reasonable conversation about how families should operate." She thought I was capitulating, that the stress of new motherhood had broken my resistance to her authority. The meeting was my surrender and acknowledgement that she'd won the power struggle and could now dictate terms for our family's future. She couldn't have been more wrong. The meeting took place in our living room on a Sunday afternoon. Patricia arrived precisely on time, dressed as if she were attending a board meeting, carrying a leather portfolio that probably contained her demands and expectations for her family's reorganization. David's brother, Mark, had driven down from Portland, ostensibly for a routine visit to meet his new niece, but actually at my invitation. I needed neutral family witnesses, people who could later testify about Patricia's behavior and admissions. David's sister Sarah was also present, though she seemed nervous and uncomfortable. She'd been Patricia's primary ally for years, but the lock incident had apparently troubled even her unconditional loyalty. Sarah kept glancing between David and Patricia, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. "Well," Patricia began, settling into her armchair like she owned it, "I'm pleased we can finally address the elephant in the room. Laraine, I know you've been emotional since Emma's birth, but it's time to establish some structure in this household." I glanced at David, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod. We'd rehearsed this moment, planned exactly how to draw Patricia into revealing her true position and intentions. "I'm interested in hearing your thoughts," I said neutrally. "What kind of structure did you have in mind?" Patricia opened her portfolio and withdrew several typed pages. She'd actually prepared a formal presentation, complete with bullet points and subsections. The arrogance was breathtaking. "First, regarding Emma's care," she began. "As the most experienced mother in this family, I think it's important that I have significant input into decisions about feeding, sleeping schedules, and medical care. I've already identified a pediatrician who's much better than the one you've chosen." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. Even she seemed to recognize that Patricia was overstepping basic boundaries. "I also think Emma should spend at least 2 nights per week at my house," Patricia continued. "It's important for children to have strong grandparent relationships. And frankly, you two need time to adjust to parenthood without the stress of constant baby care." Mark's eyebrows shot up. 2 nights a week? "Patricia, she's 3 weeks old." "Babies are more adaptable than people think," Patricia replied dismissively. "And I have much more experience with infant care than Laraine does." I remained silent, letting Patricia hang herself with her own words. The voice recorder was capturing every presumptuous demand, every assumption of authority she had no legal right to claim. "Regarding the household," Patricia continued, "I think it's clear that you need more support than you initially realized. I'm prepared to move into the guest room permanently, at least until Emma is school age. That way I can help with night feedings, housework, cooking, all the things new mothers struggle with." "Move in permanently?" David asked, his voice strained. "Well, temporarily permanent," Patricia laughed. "Just for the first few years. You'll thank me later." The recording device was capturing everything: her assumption that she could unilaterally decide to live in our house, her belief that our parenting decisions required her approval, her complete disregard for our autonomy as a family unit. "And financially," Patricia said, reaching the meat of her presentation, "I think we need to consolidate resources more efficiently. David's been struggling with money management for years, and adding a baby to the household only increases expenses." This was the moment I'd been waiting for. "What kind of consolidation?" I asked innocently. "Well, I propose that David's paychecks be deposited directly into our joint account, where I can manage expenses more efficiently. You can receive a monthly household allowance that should cover your basic needs. I'll handle all the major bills: mortgage, utilities, insurance. Oh, you don't have to worry about financial planning." The proposal was stunning in its audacity. Patricia wanted to formalize the financial abuse, to make David's economic dependency permanent, and extend it to include me and Emma. "That's an interesting suggestion," I said carefully, "but I'm curious about something. How would that work with the mortgage on this house?" Patricia's smile was confident. "Oh, that's simple. We'll refinance under David's name, probably get a better interest rate anyway. Then the house payments can come from our joint account with all the other major expenses." "Refinance under David's name," I repeated. "From my name to David's name?" "Exactly. It makes much more sense for the man to hold the mortgage. Better for your credit scores, better for tax purposes, just more traditional and appropriate." The admission was perfect. Patricia had just confessed in front of multiple witnesses that she knew I currently held the mortgage but believed it should be transferred to David. She was acknowledging my legal ownership while simultaneously demanding that I surrender it to her control. And if I don't agree to this refinancing, I asked. Patricia's mask slipped slightly. Laraine, let's be realistic. You have a newborn baby and a career to manage. You don't have time for the complicated financial decisions that homeownership requires. It's better for everyone if these responsibilities are handled by people with more experience. People like you. Well, yes. I've been managing real estate and investments for decades. You're a smart girl, but you're young and inexperienced with family financial planning. Mark was staring at Patricia with obvious disbelief. Sarah looked confused and uncomfortable. David was gripping the arm of his chair, his knuckles white, with tension. I appreciate your offer, I said finally. But I think there might be some confusion about the ownership of this house. Confusion? Patricia laughed. Dear, I understand that modern women like to feel independent, but legally, marital property belongs to both spouses. David's house is your house too, of course. Actually, I said, reaching into my purse, I think you should see this. I withdrew a certified copy of the property deed and handed it to Patricia. The color drained from her face as she read the document, her confident smile fading into confusion and then shock. This says the house is in your name only, she said slowly. That's correct. I purchased this house 3 years before I met David. It's my separate property. The silence in the room was deafening. Patricia stared at the deed, reading it again and again, as if the words might change on subsequent readings. That's impossible, she finally said. Married couples share property. David told me he owned this house. David never told you that, I said gently. You assumed it. The voice recorder captured Patricia's next words perfectly, but it changed the locks. I've been making decisions about improvements and organization. I've been treating this like David's house. Yes, I agreed. You have been. Without permission, on property you don't own and have no legal right to control. Patricia's face cycled through emotions, confusion, anger, fear, and finally desperate calculation. She was beginning to understand the magnitude of her legal exposure, the criminal liability she'd created for herself. This is ridiculous, she said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. David, tell her this is ridiculous. David looked at his mother with an expression I'd never seen before, disappointment, mixed with something approaching pity. Mom, he said quietly, you changed the locks on Laraine's house. You locked my wife and daughter out of their own home. The family meeting had accomplished exactly what I'd intended. Patricia had confessed to property crimes, revealed her intention to permanently control our finances, and demonstrated the depth of her delusion about her authority over our family. But more importantly, David had finally seen his mother clearly not as the helpful family matriarch she pretended to be, but as a controlling manipulator whose love came with strings that could strangle. Independence. The voice recording would provide devastating evidence for both criminal and civil proceedings. But the real victory was watching David finally understand that his loyalty had been misplaced for decades. The locksmith receipt in my evidence file showed exactly when Patricia had committed her crime, 3:47 p.m. on the day Emma was born. While I was unconscious under general anesthesia and fighting for my life, the timestamp proved premeditation, calculation, at a level of cruelty that even her own children couldn't defend. I want everyone to understand exactly what happened here, I said, standing in my living room while Patricia clutched the property deed with shaking hands. The voice recorder was still running, capturing every word for future use in criminal proceedings. I pulled out a manila folder containing the evidence I'd been accumulating for months. Bank statements, credit reports, hospital security footage stills, and the locksmith receipt that would destroy any claim of innocent intentions. Patricia, You committed criminal trespassing when you changed these locks without my permission. I began, my voice steady and professional. But that's not the worst of what you've done. David leaned forward, finally ready to hear the truth he'd been avoiding for years. Mark and Sarah watched in stunned silence as I laid out the scope of their mother's crimes. Over the past 3 years, you've systematically stolen approximately $127,000 from David through fraudulent transfers, unauthorized credit accounts, and fake investment schemes. Patricia's face went white. That's not, I was helping him save money. I was protecting his financial future by opening credit cards in his name and using them for your personal expenses. I asked, holding up the credit card statements. By transferring money to accounts you control and then spending it on vacations and luxury items. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Every transaction was documented, every theft proven with official bank records. Patricia's financial manipulation wasn't just cruel, it was criminal fraud on a massive scale. David, I said gently, your mother has been stealing from you since you graduated college. Every time you struggled to pay bills, every time you had to borrow money for basic expenses, it was because she was taking your income and using it for herself. David stared at the bank statements I handed him, tracing the pattern of theft with his finger. His mother had literally stolen his financial independence, keeping him trapped in dependency while living off his earnings. The car payments you could barely afford. She got kickbacks from the dealer for steering you toward the expensive lease. The loans for home improvements on her house. That money went to fund her lifestyle while you struggled with the debt. Sarah gasped. Mom, is this true? Patricia's composure finally cracked. You don't understand how family finances work. I was investing David's money, managing it responsibly. He would have just wasted it otherwise. Invested where? I asked. Show us the investment accounts. Show us the returns on this money you were supposedly managing for his benefit. Silence. Patricia couldn't produce any evidence of legitimate investment because there wasn't any. The money had been stolen, pure and simple, used to subsidize her lifestyle while keeping David financially dependent. And then there's this, I said, holding up the locksmith receipt. You planned this assault on my family while I was giving birth to your granddaughter. You calculated the exact moment when I'd be most vulnerable, most unable to defend myself. And you used that opportunity to seize control of my property. The receipt was damning evidence of premeditation. Patricia hadn't acted impulsively. She'd planned this violation days in advance, timing it for maximum cruelty and impact. The hospital security footage shows you leaving the building at 2:30 p.m., 3 hours before you knew Emma was safely delivered. You prioritized changing my locks over being present for your granddaughter's birth. Mark stood up abruptly. Jesus. Patricia, you did all this while Laraine was in surgery. I was preparing for their homecoming, Patricia said desperately. I was making sure everything was perfect for the baby. By locking them out of their own house? Sarah asked, her voice incredulous. The family dynamic was shifting in real time. Patricia's children were finally seeing her behavior clearly, understanding that her actions couldn't be rationalized as loving support or helpful involvement. Here's what's going to happen, I said, pulling out my phone. You're going to return my house keys immediately. You're going to sign documents acknowledging the theft and agreeing to full restitution. And you're going to remove yourself from all of David's financial accounts by tomorrow morning. And if I refuse? Patricia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Then I call the police right now and have you arrested for criminal trespassing, theft, fraud, and identity theft. Your choice is between cooperating voluntarily or explaining to a jury why you thought you had the right to steal from your son and lock his wife out of her own home. The legal consequences were severe and unavoidable. Patricia faced multiple felony charges with overwhelming evidence. Her only hope of avoiding prison was complete cooperation and restitution. You can't prove any of this, she said weakly, opened my laptop and showed her screenshots of the bank transfers, copies of the forged signature cards, credit reports showing unauthorized accounts. Patricia, I'm a real estate attorney. Building evidentiary cases is literally what I do for a living. The fight went out of her completely. She slumped in her chair, finally understanding that her decades of manipulation and control were over. The daughter-in-law she tried to intimidate was actually the one person in the family with the knowledge and resources to hold her accountable. David, she said desperately, you can't let her do this to me. I'm your mother. David looked at her with an expression I'd never seen before, clarity mixed with profound sadness. Mom, you locked my wife and newborn daughter out of their home. You stole over $100,000 from me. How can I defend that? The moment was transformative. After 34 years of conditioning, David was finally choosing his wife and daughter over his mother's emotional manipulation. I want my keys back, I said firmly. I want signed acknowledgement of the theft. And I want you out of our lives until you get professional help for whatever made you think this behavior was acceptable. Patricia reached into her purse with trembling hands and withdrew the new keys to my house. As she placed them on the coffee table, tears streamed down her face, not tears of remorse, but tears of rage at losing control. This isn't over, she said quietly. Yes, it is, I replied. And if you try to retaliate against my family in any way, you'll discover exactly how seriously the criminal justice system takes financial elder abuse and property crimes. The revelation was complete. Patricia's mask had been stripped away, revealing the manipulative controller beneath the loving mother facade. Her crimes were documented, her victims were finally aware of the abuse, and her power over our family was permanently broken. But most importantly, David had finally chosen his new family over his toxic family of origin. The man I'd married was, emerging from decades of psychological conditioning, ready to protect his wife and daughter from the woman who'd spent his entire life teaching him that love meant control. The police report I filed the next morning would become the foundation for multiple criminal charges against Patricia. Detective Maria Santos listened to my recorded evidence with the focused attention of someone who understood she was hearing. A slam dunk case. This is extensive documentation, she said, reviewing the financial records and voice recordings. How long have you been building this case? 6 months for the financial crimes, but the property violations just happened. She literally locked me out of my own house while I was recovering from childbirth. Detective Santos shook her head. That's a new one. I've seen plenty of family financial abuse, but never combined with this level of property crime. She's looking at serious felony charges. The criminal complaint listed 7 separate charges: criminal trespassing, breaking and entering, identity theft, wire fraud, theft by deception, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Each charge carried significant prison time, and the evidence was overwhelming, but the legal consequences were just beginning to unfold. Patricia's desperate attempts to control the narrative began immediately. Within hours of leaving our house, she'd called every family member with her version of events, painting herself as a concerned grandmother being persecuted by an unstable daughter-in-law. Laraine is having some kind of breakdown, she told David's Aunt Linda. She's making wild accusations about money, claiming I stole from David. It's clearly postpartum depression talking. But her family members had heard my evidence firsthand. Mark and Sarah had witnessed Patricia's confession about the lock changes, had seen the bank statements proving theft, had watched her arrogant demands for control over our household. Her attempts at damage control fell flat. Sarah called that evening, her voice shaky with emotion. Laraine, I'm so sorry. I had no idea Mom was doing those things to David. I thought she was just really involved and supportive. She's very good at making abuse look like love, I replied. That's how she got away with it for so long. What can I do to help? I feel terrible that I enabled this without realizing what was happening. Sarah's support was crucial for David's healing process. Knowing that his sister understood the abuse and supported his decision to press charges helped him overcome decades of conditioning about family loyalty. Mark was even more direct in his response. I moved to Portland to get away from Mom's control, he told David during a long phone conversation. I should have warned you years ago about her financial manipulation, but I hoped you'd figure it out yourself. The family unity that Patricia had always claimed to protect was crumbling around. Her children were finally comparing notes about her behavior, recognizing patterns they'd individually dismissed as quirks or excessive involvement. But Patricia wasn't going down without a fight. Her first strategy was to claim the financial transfers were legitimate family support that David had requested and approved. She hired an attorney who demanded David recant his accusations and acknowledge that the money management had been consensual. The strategy backfired spectacularly when my lawyer responded with audio recordings of Patricia describing the transfers as her unilateral decisions to protect David from his poor financial judgment. Her own words proved that David hadn't requested or approved the systematic theft of his income. Her second strategy was to attack my mental state, claiming that postpartum depression had made me paranoid and vindictive. She suggested that I was manufacturing evidence and manipulating David against his loving mother. This approach collapsed when Detective Santos pointed out that the financial crimes had been occurring for years before I even met David, and that the evidence came from official bank records, not my personal accusations. Patricia's third strategy was the most desperate, claiming that I had somehow forged the property deed and bank statements to frame her for crimes I'd committed myself. She's a lawyer, Patricia told her attorney. She knows how to manipulate documents and legal records. David never told me she owned the house because she must have hidden the purchase from him. The attorney withdrew from the case after reviewing the evidence. Property deeds are public records that can't be forged, and bank statements come directly from financial institutions. Patricia's claims weren't just false, they were delusional. Within 2 weeks, Patricia was facing not only criminal charges, but also civil lawsuits for restitution and damages. Her homeowner's insurance was investigating whether her policy covered intentional criminal acts. Her bank was reviewing all accounts for signs of additional fraud. The financial restitution process revealed the full scope of her theft, beyond the $127,000 stolen from David. She'd been using his credit to subsidize her lifestyle for years. Her house had a second mortgage she'd obtained using David's income documentation. Her car was financed under his credit history. Even her cell phone plan was being paid from his accounts. She'd built her entire post-retirement lifestyle on money stolen from her son, while convincing him that he was too financially irresponsible to manage his own income. The most satisfying consequence was watching Patricia lose the control she'd spent decades accumulating. The joint bank accounts were frozen pending criminal investigation. The credit cards she'd opened in David's name were canceled. Her access to his financial information was permanently severed. For the first time in over a decade, Patricia had to live on her actual income rather than money stolen from her son. The transition was clearly difficult. Within a month, she was behind on her mortgage and car payments, facing the financial reality that her lifestyle had been unsustainable. Without theft to support it, David watched his mother's downfall with a mixture of sadness and relief. I feel terrible that she's struggling, he told me one evening, but I also feel free for the first time since college. The psychological consequences were as significant as the legal ones. Patricia's mask had been completely stripped away, revealing the manipulative controller beneath the loving mother facade. David could finally see their relationship, clearly not as supportive family involvement, but a systematic abuse designed to maintain her power over his life. She never wanted me to succeed, he realized during one of our therapy sessions. She wanted me to need her. Every time I started to gain independence, she'd create a crisis that required her intervention. The pattern was clear in retrospect. Patricia had sabotaged David's confidence, stolen his resources, and created artificial dependencies to maintain control. Her love had come with strings attached, strings that had nearly strangled his autonomy completely. But the most important consequence was the protection it provided for Emma. Patricia's crimes had been so egregious that obtaining a restraining order was straightforward. She was legally prohibited from contact with our family, couldn't come near our house, and had no claim to visitation rights with her granddaughter. Emma would grow up free from the manipulation that had shaped David's entire life. She'd never experienced the systematic undermining of confidence, the financial control, or the emotional manipulation that had trapped her father for decades. Standing in my kitchen, holding my daughter while reviewing the police report that would send Patricia to prison, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months complete. Peace about our family's future. The woman who locked us out of our own home was about to discover what real consequences looked like. And David was finally free to become the husband and father he'd always wanted to be. The restitution agreement Patricia's attorney presented was a masterpiece of legal consequences wrapped in formal language. She would repay every stolen dollar, surrender all unauthorized accounts, and submit to financial monitoring for the next 5 years. The alternative was a jury trial where she'd face decades in prison. Total documented theft, $127,847.33, the agreement read. Defendant acknowledges this amount was taken without authorization through systematic fraud and identity theft over a 36-month period. But the restitution went beyond simple repayment. Patricia also owed damages for the emotional distress she'd caused, the legal fees we'd incurred, and the financial instability she'd created in David's life. The total judgment exceeded $180,000 more than her house was worth. How is she going to pay all this? David asked, reviewing the agreement with obvious conflict. Despite everything, he still struggled with seeing his mother face such severe consequences. She sell her house, I replied matter-of-factly. The same house she convinced you to help finance with money she stole from your paychecks. The irony was perfect. Patricia's lifestyle had been built on theft, and now that lifestyle would be dismantled to pay restitution for her crimes. The house, the car, the comfortable retirement, all of it had been purchased with David's money, and all of it would be liquidated to compensate him for her abuse. The financial monitoring provisions were particularly comprehensive. Patricia couldn't open any new credit accounts without court approval. All her bank statements would be reviewed monthly by a court-appointed guardian. She couldn't make any purchase over $500 without documentation and pre-approval. She's basically going to be on an allowance, David observed, studying the terms. The same kind of allowance she kept you on for 15 years, I pointed out. Except hers comes with criminal oversight and the threat of prison if she violates the terms. The psychological impact on Patricia was immediately visible. The woman who'd spent decades controlling every aspect of David's financial life was now subject to scrutiny and restrictions. She couldn't manipulate or escape. Her first payment was due within 30 days. $15,000 as a good faith demonstration of her commitment to restitution. When the deadline approached with no payment, her attorney called to request an extension. My client is having difficulty liquidating assets quickly enough to meet the payment schedule, he explained. Then perhaps she should have considered that before committing multiple felonies, my attorney replied. The payment schedule is based on her own financial records showing substantial assets. If she can't access that money legitimately, maybe We need to investigate how she acquired it in the first place. The threat worked. Patricia managed to produce the first payment by borrowing against her house, the same house she'd financed using David's stolen income. The circle of consequences was tightening around her with mathematical precision, but the most satisfying aspect of the financial reckoning wasn't the money. It was watching Patricia lose the control that had defined her identity for decades. She couldn't make financial decisions unilaterally anymore. She couldn't manipulate family members through strategic loans or investments. She couldn't use money as a weapon to maintain authority over her children. David's financial recovery was remarkable once Patricia's theft stopped. Within 2 months of cutting off her access to his accounts, he had more money in savings than he'd ever possessed as an adult. His stress levels dropped, his confidence improved, and he started making independent financial decisions for the first time in years. "I forgot what it felt like to not worry about money," he told me one evening while reviewing his bank statement. "I kept expecting some crisis that would drain our accounts, but the crisis was Mom all along." The court-appointed financial guardian reviewing Patricia's accounts discovered additional theft we hadn't initially identified. She'd been claiming David as a dependent on her tax returns for years, collecting refunds based on his income while he filed separately. She'd opened utility accounts in his name at her house, then defaulted on payments, damaging his credit score. Each new discovery added to the restitution amount and extended the criminal charges. What had started as theft became a pattern of systematic identity fraud spanning more than a decade. Patricia's attorney eventually advised her to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. Fighting the case would only reveal additional crimes and result in harsher penalties. The evidence was overwhelming, and her financial situation was too precarious to fund a lengthy legal battle. The plea hearing was scheduled for 3 months. After our family meeting, Patricia would acknowledge her crimes publicly, accept responsibility for the theft and manipulation, and commit to the restitution schedule under threat of immediate imprisonment. David agonized over whether to attend the hearing. Part of him wanted closure, wanted to hear his mother finally admit what she'd done to him, but part of him just wanted to move forward without reliving the trauma of her betrayal. "You don't owe her your presence," I told him. "She forfeited the right to your emotional labor when she chose to steal from you for years." In the end, David decided to attend, not for Patricia's sake, but for his own. He needed to see the legal system hold her accountable, needed to witness the consequences of behavior he'd been trained to accept as normal. The hearing was brief and businesslike. Patricia stood before the judge and recited the admission her attorney had prepared. I acknowledged taking money from my son's accounts without permission. I acknowledge opening credit accounts in his name without authorization. I acknowledge that these actions constitute theft and fraud under state law. Her voice was barely audible, but the court reporter captured every word. After 34 years of controlling David through financial manipulation, Patricia was finally admitting to the crimes that had funded her lifestyle and trapped her. Son independency. The judge's sentence was both just and poetic. 5 years probation with restitution, community service, and mandatory financial counseling. Patricia would spend the next 5 years living under the same kind of financial scrutiny she'd imposed on David, subject to monitoring and approval for every major decision. The court finds that the defendant exploited a position of trust to systematically steal from a family member, the judge stated. This pattern of financial abuse appears to have lasted for years and caused significant harm to the victim's financial stability and emotional well-being. Walking out of the courthouse, David was quiet for several minutes. Finally, he said, "I keep waiting to feel sad about this, but I just feel relieved. Like a weight I've been carrying for years just disappeared." The financial reckoning was complete. Patricia had lost her house, her control, her ability to manipulate family members through money. She was facing years of supervised poverty while slowly repaying the money she'd stolen from her son. But more importantly, David was finally free to build the financial future Patricia had stolen from him. With her access cut off and her crimes documented, he could make decisions based on his own judgment rather than her manipulation. The money Patricia had stolen was important, but the autonomy she'd stolen was priceless. Getting both back felt like justice, not revenge, but actual legal and moral accountability for decades of abuse disguised as family support. The no-contact order arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday morning, its official language creating a legal barrier between Patricia and our family that would last for 5 years. The document was comprehensive and unambiguous. She couldn't call, text, email, visit, or come within 500 feet of our home, our workplaces, or anywhere Emma might be present. Respondent is prohibited from any direct or indirect contact with protected parties, the order read. This includes contact through third parties, social media, or any other means of communication. Violation of this order constitutes criminal, contempt punishable by immediate incarceration. David held the document with shaking hands, reading it multiple times as if the words might change. After 34 years of his mother's constant presence in every major decision, the silence was both liberating and terrifying. It feels weird, he admitted. I keep expecting her to call about something or show up with advice I didn't ask for. The quiet is actually kind of overwhelming, but the quiet was exactly what our family needed to heal. Without Patricia's constant interference, David and I could establish our own parenting style, our own household routines, our own financial priorities. Emma could grow up in a home where boundaries were respected and manipulation wasn't disguised as love. The no-contact order protected more than just our immediate safety. It protected our psychological space to process the trauma Patricia had inflicted. David needed time to rebuild his confidence, to learn to trust his own judgment, to discover who he was when he wasn't constantly seeking his mother's approval. Dr. Chun had warned us that recovery from long-term psychological abuse takes time and patience. David has been conditioned for decades to doubt his own decisions and defer to external authority, she explained. Learning to trust himself again won't happen overnight. The first few weeks were the hardest. David would reach for his phone to call Patricia about mundane decisions, which pediatrician to choose, how to handle Emma's sleep schedule, whether we should refinance our mortgage. The impulse to seek her approval was so deeply ingrained that breaking it required conscious effort every day. I started to call Mom about Emma's feeding schedule, he told me one evening, looking embarrassed. Then I remembered that she doesn't get a vote anymore. We get to decide what's best for our daughter. That realization was transformative. For the first time in his adult life, David was making parenting decisions based on his own research, his own instincts, and his partnership with me, rather than his mother's demands for control. The extended family boundaries were more complex to navigate. Sarah wanted to maintain relationships with both David and Patricia, which created awkward situations when she tried to serve as a go-between or messenger. Mom asked me to tell you that she's sorry and wants to work things out, Sarah said during one of our phone conversations. Sarah, I appreciate that you're trying to help, I replied, but Patricia needs to communicate through her attorney or not at all. The no-contact order exists for a reason. Eventually, Sarah understood that carrying messages from Patricia violated the spirit of the protective order, even if it didn't technically violate the letter of the law. She learned to keep her relationships with David and Patricia completely separate, never discussing one with the other. Mark took a different approach, using Patricia's crimes as an opportunity to address his own unresolved issues with her controlling behavior. He wrote her a letter explaining how her manipulation had driven him across the country and damaged their relationship for years. I thought moving to Portland would protect me from your control, his letter read, but I should have been protecting David instead. I'm sorry I didn't warn him about what you were doing. The family dynamic shifted dramatically once Patricia's crimes were exposed. Her children could finally discuss her behavior honestly, comparing notes about manipulation tactics they'd each experienced individually. The conversation was both healing and horrifying. Patricia had been psychologically abusing all of them in different ways for decades, but the most important boundary was the one protecting Emma from inheriting the dysfunction that had shaped David's childhood. Patricia would never have the opportunity to undermine Emma's confidence, steal her money, or teach her that love came with strings attached. I want Emma to grow up knowing that her opinions matter, David said one night while watching our daughter sleep. I want her to trust her own judgment and never feel like she needs someone else's permission to make decisions about her own life. The contrast with David's upbringing was stark. Patricia had trained him to believe that independent thinking was selfish, that questioning authority was disrespectful, that needing help proved his inadequacy. Emma would grow up with the opposite messages, that independence was healthy, that questioning was smart, that asking for help was a sign of strength. Our household routines reflected these new values. We made decisions together through discussion and compromise rather than deferring to external authority. We encouraged Emma's early expressions of preference and personality rather than trying to mold her into predetermined expectations. The financial boundaries were equally important. David took control of his own money for the first time since college, learning to budget, save, and invest according to his own priorities rather than Patricia's manipulation. He discovered that he was actually quite good with money when he wasn't being sabotaged by someone stealing his income. I feel like I'm learning to be an adult at 34, he told me after successfully managing our household budget for 3 months without any crisis or drama. The marriage counseling sessions helped us establish boundaries between our nuclear family and extended family expectations. We learned to prioritize our own needs and Emma's well-being over family pressure to maintain relationships that weren't healthy. You don't owe loyalty to people who harm you, Dr. Chun reminded us. Family relationships should be based on mutual respect and genuine care, not obligation and guilt. The professional boundaries were important too. Patricia's manipulation had extended into David's career choices, influencing which jobs he took and which opportunities he pursued. Without her interference, he could make career decisions based on his own interests and our family's needs. Within 6 months of the no-contact order, David had interviewed for and accepted a position with a prestigious law firm that offered better pay and more interesting work. Patricia had previously discouraged him from applying to firms like this, claiming he wasn't qualified or experienced enough. She wanted to keep me small, he realized. Every time I showed interest in advancing my career, she'd find reasons why I wasn't ready or why the opportunity wasn't as good as it seemed. The legal protections gave us space to heal, but the emotional boundaries were what allowed us to thrive. We could finally build the family we wanted without constantly defending our choices or managing someone else's emotional needs. Looking at Emma playing in her nursery, the nursery we decorated, according to our own tastes rather than Patricia's demands, I felt profound gratitude for the legal system that had protected our family from further abuse. The no-contact order wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a shield that allowed love to flourish without manipulation, independence to develop without sabotage, and trust to grow without betrayal. Patricia had spent decades teaching David that boundaries were selfish and that family meant unlimited access to control each other's lives. The legal consequences of her crimes had taught us all a different lesson, that healthy relationships require respect for limits, and that love without boundaries isn't love at all. The new baby photos scattered across our coffee table told a story of transformation that extended far beyond Emma's growth milestones. In the pictures from her first weeks, taken during Patricia's reign of terror, David looks anxious and uncertain, constantly glancing off camera as if seeking approval for holding his own daughter. In the recent photos, he's relaxed and confident, making silly faces at Emma while she giggles in response. "Look at this one," I said, showing David a picture from Emma's 6-month birthday. "You're not looking to anyone else for confirmation that you're doing it right. You're just enjoying being her dad." The healing process had been gradual but undeniable. Month by month, David reclaimed pieces of himself that Patricia's manipulation had slowly eroded. His confidence in parenting decisions grew stronger. His financial anxiety disappeared as he learned to trust his own budgeting skills. Most importantly, his ability to enjoy life returned without the constant undercurrent of seeking maternal approval. Dr. Chun had warned us that recovery from psychological abuse follows predictable stages: shock, denial, anger, grief, and finally, acceptance. David had worked through each phase methodically, sometimes cycling back through earlier emotions as new realizations emerged. "I'm angry that I lost so many years to her manipulation," he told me during one particularly difficult therapy session. "I'm angry that I let her steal from me, that I didn't protect you during pregnancy, that I almost let her control Emma's life too, that the anger phase had been necessary and ultimately healing." David needed to feel appropriately outraged by his mother's behavior before he could forgive himself for enabling it. The anger gave him strength to maintain boundaries that love and loyalty had made difficult to enforce. The grief phase was perhaps the most painful. David had to mourn the mother he'd thought he had while accepting the reality of the mother who'd actually raised him. Patricia's love hadn't been unconditional. It had been contingent on his dependence, his compliance, his willingness to sacrifice his autonomy for her comfort. "I keep waiting for her to become the mom I needed," he'd confessed. "Even after everything that's happened, part of me still hopes she apologize and change." Dr. Chun had gently helped him understand that accepting Patricia's limitations was part of his healing. He couldn't save her from the consequences of her choices, and he couldn't fix a relationship that had been fundamentally unequal from the beginning. Emma's development milestones became opportunities for David to experience healthy parenting. For the first time, when she started crawling, he baby-proofed the house based on his own research rather than Patricia's directives. When she began eating solid foods, he and I made decisions together about nutrition and feeding schedules without external interference. "I actually enjoy this," he said one evening while feeding Emma her dinner. "I'm not constantly worried about doing it wrong or disappointing someone. I can just focus on what Emma needs." The financial healing was equally remarkable. With Patricia's, theft stopped and her access permanently severed. David discovered he was naturally conservative and thoughtful about money management. The irresponsibility Patricia had criticized for years had been manufactured by her own sabotage. "Look at this," he said proudly, showing me our 6-month savings account statement. "We've got an emergency fund, retirement contributions, even money set aside for Emma's college." "I never thought I could manage this kind of financial planning." His career confidence returned as well. The job interview that had initially terrified him, Patricia had spent years convincing him he wasn't qualified for advanced positions, resulted in a significant promotion and salary increase. Without her voice in his head predicting failure, David could present himself authentically and professionally. The marriage counseling sessions helped us rebuild trust and intimacy that Patricia's interference had gradually eroded. We learned to make decisions as a partnership rather than seeking external validation for our choices. Our communication improved as David stopped filtering his thoughts through anticipated maternal judgment. "I feel like I'm meeting you for the first time," I told David after a particularly good therapy session. "The real you, not the version that was constantly modified to avoid your mother's criticism." Emma's first birthday party was a celebration of more than just her growth. It was a celebration of our family's liberation from toxic control. We invited friends and family members who supported our boundaries and respected our autonomy. The guest list was smaller than it might have been with Patricia's involvement, but it was filled with people who genuinely cared about our happiness rather than their own authority. David gave a toast that night that brought tears to my eyes. A year ago, I was terrified of making the wrong parenting decisions. Today, I know that loving Emma and doing our best is enough. No one else gets to define what good parents look like for our family. The contrast with his old mindset was profound. Patricia had trained him to believe that parenting required constant, external guidance and approval. Now he understood that parenting required love, attention, and the willingness to learn from mistakes, none of which needed his mother's permission. The extended family relationships had stabilized into healthier patterns as well. Sarah and Mark learned to have individual relationships with David that didn't involve Patricia as an intermediary. Holiday gatherings became more relaxed without her presence dominating conversations and decision-making. "It's weird," Sarah admitted during one family dinner. "Without Mom here controlling everything, we actually talk to each other instead of performing for her approval." Even Patricia's absence had become a form of healing. The quiet spaces where her demands and criticism used to intrude were now filled with our own family's laughter, conversations, and genuine intimacy. We could make plans without considering her schedule, decorate our home according to our own taste, and raise Emma according to our own values. The legal consequences had provided protection, but the psychological healing had provided freedom. David was becoming the husband and father he'd always wanted to be, unencumbered by the fear of maternal disapproval that had shaped every major decision of his adult life. I wish I could go back and tell my younger self that Mom's approval wasn't worth sacrificing my own judgment, he reflected one evening while reading to Emma. But maybe Emma will never have to learn that lesson because she grew up knowing her own. Worth isn't dependent on anyone else's opinion. The healing wasn't. Complete recovery from decades of psychological manipulation takes years, not months. But the foundation was solid, built on legal protection, therapeutic support, and the daily practice of making decisions based on our family's actual needs rather than external pressure. Looking at Emma babbling happily in her high chair, surrounded by toys we'd chosen and books we'd selected, I felt profound gratitude for the events that had seemed so devastating a year ago. Patricia's cruelty had ultimately freed us from her control, giving Emma the chance to grow up in a home where love didn't come with conditions and where healthy boundaries were respected rather than violated. The woman who'd locked us out of our own house had inadvertently given us the key to our own liberation. The new house keys in my palm felt different from the old ones, heavier somehow, weighted with the knowledge of what I'd fought to protect. David had surprised me by having them specially made, engraved with a small inscription, "Home is where love lives freely." It had been 18 months since Patricia changed our locks, thinking she was asserting control over our family. Instead, she triggered a reckoning that ultimately freed us from decades of manipulation and gave Emma the chance to grow up in a household where boundaries were respected and love didn't come with conditions attached to the legal proceedings. Had concluded with Patricia serving 18 months of supervised probation, during which she'd made steady restitution payments and attended court-mandated counseling for financial abuse. The no-contact order remained in effect, protecting our family from any attempt at reconciliation that wasn't genuine and therapeutic. "Do you ever think about what would happen if she actually changed?" David asked one evening as we watched Emma take her first tentative steps across our living room. "I think about whether change is even possible for someone who spent 40 years perfecting manipulation techniques," I replied honestly. "But more importantly, I think about whether we'd ever be able to trust that change was real and not just another strategy for regaining control." The question of forgiveness had been a recurring theme in our therapy sessions. Dr. Chen had helped us understand that forgiveness didn't require restoring relationship. It simply meant releasing the anger that could otherwise consume our energy and happiness. You can forgive someone for your own peace while still maintaining boundaries for your own protection, she'd explained. Forgiveness and reconciliation are two completely different processes. David had reached a place of what he called emotional neutrality regarding his mother. He wasn't consumed by anger anymore, but he also wasn't burdened by guilt about protecting his family from her toxic influence. I hope she finds peace and learns to have healthy relationships, he said. But that healing has to happen without us as her victims. Emma deserves to grow up without that dysfunction, and we deserve to build our marriage without constant interference. Emma's development had become a daily reminder of what healthy childhood looked like. At 18 months, she was curious, confident, and secure in her attachments. She explored her environment fearlessly because she trusted that David and I would keep her safe. She expressed her preferences clearly because she'd learned that her voice mattered in our household. She's going to grow up knowing her own worth, I said, watching Emma clap excitedly as she conquered the distance between the couch and coffee table. She'd never have to unlearn the message that love requires sacrifice of autonomy. The contrast with David's childhood was stark and intentional. Where Patricia had used guilt and financial manipulation to maintain control, we encouraged Emma's independence and celebrated her growing abilities. Where Patricia had made love conditional on compliance, we offered Emma unconditional acceptance while teaching appropriate boundaries. Our financial recovery had exceeded every expectation. With Patricia's theft stopped and David's confidence restored, we'd been able to save money, invest wisely, and plan for Emma's future education. The house that had been the center of Patricia's power grab was now truly ours, mortgage nearly paid off, renovated according to our own taste, filled with the laughter of a family that made decisions together. Remember when you thought you were bad with money? I teased David as we reviewed our investment portfolio. Turns out you're actually quite good at it when someone isn't stealing your income and sabotaging your confidence. The career advancement that Patricia had discouraged for years had materialized once David stopped seeking her approval for professional decisions. He'd been promoted twice, had taken on challenging cases that showcased his abilities, and was being considered for partnership track positions that would have seemed impossible during his mother's manipulation. But the most profound change was in our marriage itself. Without Patricia's constant interference, David and I had discovered we were genuinely compatible partners who enjoyed making decisions together and supporting each other's goals. The relationship Patricia had tried to control and undermine had actually grown stronger once her toxic influence was removed. I feel like we're finally living our own life instead of performing roles someone else assigned to us, David said during one of our regular check-ins about family dynamics. The extended family relationships had settled into healthier patterns as well. Sarah and Mark had both benefited from Patricia's forced absence, discovering their own voices and making independent decisions without her manipulation. Family gatherings were more relaxed, more genuine, and more focused on actual connection, rather than managing Patricia's need for control. It's amazing how much easier family dinners are when no one's walking on eggshells, Sarah had observed during Emma's first birthday party. The legal protections remained in place, but they'd become less necessary as time passed. Patricia's ability to insert herself into our decisions had been permanently severed, and David's psychological dependence on her approval had been replaced with confidence in his own judgment. Sometimes I wondered what Patricia's life looked like now, whether she'd learned anything from the consequences of her actions, whether she'd developed any insight into how her behavior had damaged her relationships with all her children. But those wondered quickly faded, replaced by gratitude for the life we'd built in her absence. Whatever happens with Mom, we know we can protect our family David said when I shared these thoughts. We know how to recognize manipulation, how to maintain boundaries, and how to prioritize what actually matters. Looking at Emma as she played with blocks, building towers and knocking them down with delighted giggles, I felt overwhelming gratitude for the events that had seemed so devastating when they occurred. Patricia's cruelty had ultimately revealed her true nature and given us the evidence needed to remove her toxic influence from our lives permanently. The locks she'd changed had been meant to keep us out, but they'd actually kept dysfunction out. The house she'd tried to claim had become a sanctuary where love flourished without conditions, where decisions were made through partnership rather than manipulation, and where a little girl could grow up knowing that her voice mattered and her boundaries would be respected. If you're reading this and recognizing patterns in your own, family financial control disguised as help, boundaries violated in the name of love, your autonomy gradually eroded through guilt and obligation, now that you have more power than you realize. Document everything, trust your instincts, and remember that healthy love never requires you to sacrifice your independence or accept abuse. The keys to your own liberation might be closer than you think. Sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones holding you back from becoming who you're meant to be. Emma handed me one of her blocks, babbling something that sounded almost like mama, and I felt the weight of responsibility and privilege that came with raising a child. Free from the manipulation that had shaped previous generations, we'd broken the cycle. Patricia's legacy of control and dysfunction would end with us, and Emma would inherit something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that she was worthy of love that came without strings attached, respect that didn't require her compliance, and a family that would support her independence rather than undermine it. That was worth every difficult moment of the fight to reclaim our autonomy. That was worth the keys we'd had to fight to keep.